The old church cellar was silent, save for the soft scrape of wood against stone as Daniel Alvarez, the quiet archivist, pushed aside another warped crate. Dust swirled in the air, the motes catching faint candlelight like drifting embers. He had worked in this place for years, cataloging forgotten relics, yellowed records, and moth-eaten vestments no one else bothered to care about. He was invisible to most. The priest saw only a diligent assistant, and the visiting scholars hardly knew his name. But today, fate had guided his hands to the edge of something long concealed. Behind the stacked crates, he noticed the outline of a small wooden door embedded in the cellar wall. Unlike the others, this one was sealed with rusted iron bands. His heart thudded. Why had no one spoken of it? Daniel brushed at the cobwebs, his fingers trembling as if he could feel the centuries pressing against the wood. He hesitated, hearing the echo of his own self-doubt. I'm just an archivist. I'm no explorer, no scholar. Yet his curiosity, that quiet hunger for hidden truths, pushed him forward. With a grunt, he pried the iron bands loose, using a crowbar borrowed from the sacristy. The sound of metal snapping echoed like a gunshot through the cellar. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow passage. A stale wind rushed past him, carrying the scent of damp earth and something older, something forgotten. He lit another candle, the flame flickering nervously, and stepped inside. The passage led to a cramped chamber carved directly into the stone foundation. At its center lay a chest, half buried under debris. Its surface was unlike anything Daniel had seen in all his years among archives. Carved symbols, etched with deliberate care, but not of Latin or Gothic design. His breath caught as he ran a hand over the markings. They were curved, geometric, alive with a rhythm that spoke of another world. Daniel's pulse quickened. His mind drifted to memories, long-buried nights as a boy, when he had pored over books of ancient civilizations in the dim light of his parents' modest home. The priests had thought it a useless obsession, but Daniel had never let go of the shapes, the glyphs, the foreign beauty of languages long dead. Now, those same patterns stared back at him from the chest in a European church cellar. A voice in his head whispered, "No, this is impossible. How could these symbols be here?" His knees nearly gave way as he realized what it meant. This chest had no rightful place in Europe. Hands shaking, Daniel tugged at the lid, the wood groaning in protest. The hinges gave way with a sharp crack, and the chest exhaled a puff of air like a sigh from the past. Inside, wrapped in layers of decayed cloth, was a bundle. Daniel lifted it with reverence, feeling the weight of centuries pressing against his palms. As he peeled back the cloth, his breath hitched. A book, no, a codex lay within. Its pages were thick bark paper, still astonishingly intact, covered in bold lines of painted glyphs. Vibrant reds, blues, and blacks stared up at him, untouched by time. He staggered back, candlelight trembling over the ink of the ancients. For a moment, Daniel could not breathe. He knew what he was seeing. He had seen reproductions of similar works in rare libraries, studied sketches in obscure journals. But never, not even in dreams, had he imagined holding a genuine Mayan codex. And yet, here it was, in the cellar of a Spanish church. The weight of the discovery pressed upon him like a tidal wave. Questions surged through his mind. How did it arrive here? Who had hidden it? And why had it been sealed away for centuries? The cellar seemed to pulse with the silence of the past, as if the stones themselves knew the magnitude of what had just been uncovered. Daniel clutched the codex to his chest, his heart pounding with equal parts fear and exhilaration. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Professor Marquez's life. The archivist raised his eyes to the shadows beyond the chamber. Somewhere in those pages, he knew, lay truths powerful enough to unravel the stories told by empires. And though he did not yet realize it, this quiet man was about to set in motion a storm that would humiliate the proud and vindicate the overlooked. Daniel's candlelight wavered as he set the codex aside on a flat stone ledge. The chest that had cradled it for centuries still sat open, its interior lined with a velvet that had long since turned to dust. Beneath the codex's resting place were smaller fragments, bronze fittings, shards of ceramic painted in the same hues of crimson and obsidian. He picked one up, brushing it clean with his sleeve, and marveled at the spiral designs. They were unmistakably Mesoamerican, yet here they lay, thousands of miles from their origin. The archivist swallowed hard. He glanced around the chamber as if expecting someone to step from the shadows, accuse him of trespassing, and wrench the treasures from his hands. But no one came. Only the distant creak of the church above reminded him that life continued, unaware of the revelation beneath its foundations. His eyes returned to the chest. Strange carvings stretched across its lid, patterns that reminded him of the serpentine forms of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent of Mayan and Aztec myth. Intertwined with those glyphs, however, were crosses, Christian crosses. The juxtaposition sent a chill crawling up his spine. Daniel whispered to himself, How could this exist?" His voice echoed softly against the stone. He imagined the hands that had carried the chest across oceans, the priests or sailors who had sworn secrecy, burying this fusion of faiths beneath the sanctuary. Had the chest been a trophy of conquest, or a relic smuggled away by someone who understood its power? Kneeling beside it, he traced the carvings again, his fingers trembling. The archivist's mind, long trained to be orderly and silent, now raced with a storm of questions. He thought of the endless scrolls he had catalogued, baptismal records, sacramental receipts, sermons, and how small they seemed compared to what now lay before him. But the codex was alive. He carefully pulled the bundle closer. Even under candlelight, the pigments glowed with an intensity that felt unearthly. On one page, rows of glyphs coiled around a depiction of a man kneeling before a temple, his eyes lifted to the heavens. Daniel leaned close, his pulse quickening, as he recognized patterns from his boyhood studies. Though he lacked formal training, the obsession of his youth had left him with fragments of understanding. One glyph repeated often a jaguar face, jaw open in perpetual roar. Another, a hand holding maze, appeared in sequences that suggested ritual or offering. Daniel closed his eyes, whispering fragments of translation. The jaguar, protector, sacrifice. His own voice startled him. He remembered being 10 years old, clutching a tattered book in the corner of his father's small house, reciting strange words while his parents argued about bills. Back then, his fascination with ancient scripts was little more than a child's escape. His teachers dismissed him. The priests redirected him toward more practical paths, and eventually, he buried that passion beneath layers of silence. Now, the same childish knowledge surged back, demanding recognition. It was as if the codex itself had waited for him, and him alone, to breathe life into its words. Daniel felt his throat tighten. Why me? I'm just a caretaker of dust and parchment. Yet as his hand hovered over the glyphs, he knew no one else in this church could see what he saw. A sudden noise made him flinch, the distant slam of a door above. He quickly wrapped the codex in its cloth and tucked it back into the chest. His heart hammered as footsteps echoed faintly from the nave, but no one descended. He exhaled, his nerves raw. Daniel extinguished the candle and sat in darkness for a moment, his breath shallow. The weight of the codex seemed to pulse in the blackness, pressing upon him with the gravity of untold centuries. He could not leave it there, not when it could be lost again to mold, fire, or indifference. With trembling resolve, he lifted the codex and carried it carefully back through the narrow passage, closing the hidden door behind him. In his arms, history slept, ink and bark, bound into a truth that could topple arrogance and reshape the world's understanding of itself. Above, the bells began to toll midnight. Daniel clutched the codex tighter, whispering to himself, "They won't believe me, but they will see." Daniel's chamber at the rectory was modest. Bare walls, a single wooden desk, and shelves crammed with dull parish records. Yet tonight, as he set the codex gently upon the desk, the room felt transformed into the beating heart of history itself. The candlelight threw trembling shadows across the pages, and the vibrant pigments seemed to glow as though the ink itself carried a secret fire. He leaned over the first open leaf, eyes hungry. The bark paper crackled softly beneath his fingertips, surprisingly resilient despite centuries of exile. Each glyph was alive. Jaguar faces, maize stalks, serpent coils, and celestial patterns. Daniel's throat tightened. His childhood obsession, the symbols he had memorized in secret notebooks, rose to the surface. Words began to whisper in his mind. The journey, across the water. Stars guide the jaguar. He spoke haltingly, his own translations tentative. Still, they resonated with a clarity that chilled him. His lips trembled as he traced one sequence. A depiction of men in feathered headdresses, pointing toward ships with large sails. His heart thundered. This can't be. 1,000 questions collided in his mind. Could it be describing voyages? Mayan explorers crossing the seas? If this codex was genuine, and every fiber of his being screamed that it was, it held the power to rewrite the boundaries of history itself. Daniel pressed his hands against his temples. You're just an archivist. No one will listen. They'll laugh at you, like always. But then another voice pushed through, softer, insistent. You've been preparing for this moment all your life, even when you didn't know it. Memories surfaced his father's mocking voice, telling him to stop wasting time with useless drawings. The sting of priests dismissing his curiosity as childish fancy. Each dismissal, each quiet humiliation, returned now as fuel. For the first time, Daniel felt that his silence, his years in the shadows, had preserved him for this singular revelation. He turned the page. A painted figure knelt before what looked like a temple, offering maize to a blazing sun. Around the image spiraled glyphs, more complex than the first. Daniel leaned closer, whispering translations in fragments. Sacrifice, promise, stars align. The journey continues. His breath quickened. The codex wasn't merely ritual, it was narrative. A story unfolding across its leaves. And somewhere in these pages lay the key to understanding why it had traveled so far, why it had been hidden in a church cellar in Spain. He lit another candle, then another, flooding the room with golden light. The air thickened with smoke and dust, but he scarcely noticed. Hours passed as he pored over the codex, his eyes burning, his mind ablaze. He copied glyphs feverishly into his notebook, sketching figures until his fingers cramped. At last, exhaustion forced him to stop. His head dropped into his hands, his heart pounding with both exhilaration and dread. He knew he could not keep this discovery to himself. Yet the thought of revealing it filled him with terror. What if they mocked him? What if they dismissed it as forgery? Worse, what if they took it from him, burying it once again? The toll of the bells at dawn jarred him from his spiraling thoughts. Daniel straightened, blinking at the codex. Its painted eyes seemed to gaze back at him with quiet defiance, daring him to share its truth. A surge of determination rose in him, fierce and unexpected. They may laugh, but they will listen. He wrapped the codex carefully, securing it in cloth and twine. His fingers lingered on the cover for a moment, reluctant to part from its presence. Then he drew a sharp breath. Today he would bring it to the university. Today he would face the professors who had long looked down on him. And today, perhaps, the world would begin to understand what he had uncovered. The university's stone corridors echoed with the archivist's hesitant footsteps. Daniel clutched the wrapped codex beneath his arm as though it were both shield and burden. He had not slept. The fire in his veins had carried him here, his heart hammering with every step. To others, he looked no more than a meek clerk carrying old records, but in his arms lay a storm that could upend centuries of certainty. He paused before the tall oak door of Professor Marquez's office. Marquez, the man whose name carried weight in every scholarly circle of Spain, was known for his wit as sharp as a blade, and for his scorn toward dreamers and amateurs. Daniel's stomach knotted. He could already hear the laughter, the cutting remarks, Still, he raised his hand and knocked. "Enter," came the voice, curt and impatient. Marquez sat at a desk, piled with manuscripts and maps, his sharp eyes barely lifting as Daniel entered. "Ah, the church sends me their little archivist. What dust-covered triviality do you bring me this time?" Daniel swallowed hard. "Professor, I've found something. In the cellar. I believe it is of great importance." He carefully unwrapped the cloth, revealing the codex. The pigments glimmered in the morning light that streamed through the window. For a heartbeat, silence hung in the air. Marquez leaned forward, his brows narrowing. He reached out, hesitated, then snatched the codex with a dismissive scoff. Another forgery, no doubt. I've seen hundreds. Do you know how many fools parade painted paper before me each year?" Daniel's face burned, but he forced his voice steady. "This is not a forgery. Look at the glyphs, the sequence, the pigments. These are authentic Mayan." Marquez chuckled, shaking his head. "Authentic? And you, a parish archivist, are suddenly the expert? Leave the deciphering of civilizations to men who have devoted their lives to study." He flipped through the pages carelessly, as though they were no more than cheap copies. Inside Daniel's chest, humiliation warred with fury. For years, he had stayed silent, the obedient shadow in the archives. But now, his voice sharpened. "I know what I've seen, and I know enough to recognize these glyphs. They tell of a journey across the ocean, Professor. Ships, stars, contact." Marquez's laughter rang through the office. "A fairy tale. The Mayans reaching Europe? Next you'll tell me they built Rome's aqueducts." Daniel clenched his fists, nails biting his palms. The sting of dismissal clawed at old scars. The schoolmasters who mocked his interests. The priests who urged him toward useful labor. His father's bitter derision. All those voices blended now into Marquez's disdain. Yet another memory rose, soft but unyielding. Daniel as a boy, poring over crude reproductions of glyphs by candlelight, whispering words no one else cared to learn. That child's voice spoke now inside him. "You were meant for this. Don't let him bury you again." Summoning his courage, Daniel leaned forward. "If you refuse to see the truth, others will. This codex does not belong hidden in darkness any longer." Marquez froze, his eyes narrowing to cold slits. For a flicker of a moment, something sharp fear, perhaps, crossed his face. He slammed the codex shut and thrust it back into Daniel's hands. "Take your trinket, then. Parade it before the fools who hunger for myths. But mark my words, when they laugh you out of their halls, do not come crawling back here." Daniel accepted the codex, his hands steady, despite the storm raging within him. He bowed his head slightly, not in submission, but in quiet defiance. Without another word, he turned and walked out, his steps echoing through the corridor like a drumbeat of resolve. As the doors closed behind him, Marquez sat alone, staring at the memory of those painted glyphs. He whispered under his breath, almost unwillingly, "Across the water, stars guide the jaguar." But pride smothered the thought. He shook his head, dismissing the archivist with a scoff. Still, unease lingered like smoke. Daniel, meanwhile, stepped into the sunlight, the codex secure in his arms. He no longer felt like a shadow. He was a man carrying fire into a world of arrogance. The lecture hall was packed, its vaulted ceiling amplifying the murmurs of restless scholars and students. Word had spread quickly. An unknown archivist claimed to possess a Mayan codex, and curiosity had dragged even the most skeptical professors into attendance. Daniel stood near the podium, his chest tight, the codex wrapped in cloth upon the table before him. He felt their eyes on him, 1,000 whispers branding him a fool before he had even spoken. At the front row sat Professor Marquez, arms crossed, a thin smirk playing at his lips. His eyes gleamed with the smugness of a man already certain of victory. Daniel's hands trembled as he unwrapped the codex, exposing its vibrant pages to the hall. Gasps fluttered through the crowd. The pigments, still alive with color, spoke louder than Daniel could. Clearing his throat, he began. his voice softer than he intended. This codex was found in the cellar of San Miguel Church. Its glyphs, they tell a story unlike any in recorded history. A chuckle rippled through the audience. One professor leaned to another, muttering audibly. Another deluded dreamer. Laughter followed. Daniel's heart wavered, but then his gaze fell upon the painted jaguar glyph. He remembered the nights as a boy, whispering to himself in secret, and his voice steadied. These pages describe a voyage, not a myth, not allegory, a voyage across the sea. He pointed to the depiction of men in feathered headdresses beside ships with sails. This is no mere imagination, it is narrative. Mayan voyagers. And if this is authentic, it proves contact centuries before Columbus. The hall erupted in noise. Some scoffed openly, others whispered in excitement. Marquez rose slowly, spreading his hands as if to calm children. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said smoothly, "what we see here is yet another forgery meant to prey on gullible minds. Our archivist, though diligent in dusting pews and cataloging hymnals, is no scholar. Shall we really entertain the notion that he has outwitted centuries of research?" The audience chuckled. Emboldened by Marquez's arrogance, Daniel felt heat rising in his chest. He wanted to retreat, to vanish into the shadows where he had lived his life. But then he caught the eyes of a young student in the back, wide with awe, as she stared at the codex. That look ignited something in him. He turned back to the page, pointing to a sequence of glyphs: jaguar, maze, journey, stars. These glyphs repeat in a structure consistent with Mayan narrative traditions. "Look closely." His voice rang louder now, trembling with conviction. "This is no crude imitation. The pigments themselves, made from cochineal and indigo, are authentic to Mesoamerican origin. This cannot be dismissed with a laugh." The hall grew quieter. Several professors leaned forward, their skepticism strained by curiosity. Marquez's smirk faltered. Daniel pressed on, his voice firm. "I may not wear your titles, I may not have your accolades, but I know these glyphs. I have studied them in silence for years. And this codex," he lifted it carefully, "the pages catching the light, will not be buried in darkness again." For a heartbeat, silence. Then a ripple of voices broke through, some still mocking, others startled, and a few, remarkably, intrigued. One elderly scholar in the corner whispered, "The pigments? They are too vivid to be counterfeit." Another muttered, "The glyph sequence. I've never seen such consistency." Marquez slammed his hand on the table. "Nonsense! Do not be swayed by theatrics. This man is nothing, an archivist, a nobody." But the seed of doubt had been planted. The codex had spoken for itself, and for the first time, Daniel saw cracks in the wall of arrogance. Inside him, a voice whispered, steady and sure, "They will see, they must." The storm broke not in the lecture hall, but days later, when Daniel returned to his modest chamber only to find the codex gone. His breath froze in his lungs. The desk where he had left it lay bare, save for the faint imprint of its weight upon the wood. His chest collapsed inward as though struck, and panic clawed up his throat. He tore the room apart. Drawers yanked open, shelves overturned, but the truth gnawed at him. Someone had stolen it. A memory struck with venomous clarity, Marquez's eyes narrowing when the hall began to murmur. His lips pressed thin at the mention of pigments and glyphic structures. Daniel stumbled backward, collapsing into his chair. Rage burned in his chest, but underneath it was despair. Without the codex, he was nothing but a fool with wild claims. The following morning, word spread across the university like wildfire. Professor Marquez had unveiled a Mayan codex, discovered, he claimed, during his own private research into colonial archives. Students whispered of his genius. Scholars marveled at his brilliance. Daniel's stomach churned with sickness as he overheard them in the corridors. He confronted Marquez in his office, his voice hoarse with fury. "You stole it!" Marquez didn't flinch. He reclined in his chair, fingers steepled, his expression infuriatingly calm. "Careful, Alvarez. Accusations without proof make you look desperate. Besides," he gestured toward the shelves where the codex now sat. "Displayed behind glass, history favors those who can wield it, not those who stumble upon it." Daniel's fists shook. "That codex does not belong to you. It belongs to the truth." Marquez smirked, leaning forward. "Truth is written by men like me. Do you think anyone will believe the word of a church archivist over a professor of renown? You're a shadow, Alvarez. Always were, always will be." The words cut deep, but beneath the sting, something stirred an ember that refused to die. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. Then he straightened, his voice quiet but sharp. "You can silence me. You can claim my discovery, but you cannot erase what is written in those pages. The glyphs speak for themselves, and someday they will condemn your arrogance." Marquez's eyes flickered, a crack in the mask of superiority. For the first time, Daniel saw it. Fear. That night, Daniel returned to the church, heart weighed down by betrayal. He sat in the empty nave, staring at the altar candles. His mind replayed the years of being overlooked, mocked, forgotten. Each slight had been another stone laid upon his back. And yet, even now, he felt the codex's presence burning in his memory. He had copied many glyphs into his notebook. He still carried the knowledge, even if the artifact was stolen. He opened his notebook and ran his fingers over the crude sketches of jaguars, mays, and stars. He whispered aloud, "I won't let him bury me. I won't let him bury the truth." In that quiet vow, Daniel felt the shadows of his life peel away. For the first time, he saw his silence not as weakness, but as patience. Marquez had taken the codex, but Daniel carried its voice within him, and that voice would not be silenced. Winter's breath swept across the university. Yet inside its great library, Daniel's resolve burned hotter than ever. He sat at a corner table, his notebook spread wide, sketches and glyphs inked across the pages. Night after night he returned, piecing together the fragments he had copied from the codex before it was stolen. Each line, each jaguar glyph, revealed more of the story. The codex spoke of voyagers. Painted men in feathered headdresses stood upon the prows of ships, sails stretched wide against the wind. Glyphs of mays and jaguars marched alongside depictions of stars, constellations drawn with uncanny accuracy. Daniel's lips trembled as he whispered the sequence. Jaguar leads, mays sustains, stars guide, across the water. It was no myth. It was testimony. Mayan voyagers had crossed oceans, and if the codex had survived in Spain, then the tale was no legend, but fact. One evening, as Daniel bent over his notes, the door creaked. A timid voice whispered, "Señor Alvarez." He turned to see a young woman, Elena, the student whose eyes had shone with wonder during his presentation. She stepped forward, clutching a stack of books. "I've studied your sketches. They match known Mayan codices. Professor Marquez cannot explain that away." Daniel's throat tightened. For weeks he had been mocked, dismissed, and erased, but here was someone who believed. "You truly see it?" he asked, voice trembling. "Yes," Elena said firmly, "and others are starting to. Marquez's arrogance blinds him, but scholars are talking. They say your glyphs are too precise to be invention. If you publish your notes, hope, fragile but radiant, flickered in Daniel's chest. For years he had been invisible, his voice swallowed by silence. But now the codex's truth was spreading, carried not by prestige but by conviction. Yet Marquez fought back with venom. He published articles denouncing Daniel, branding him a fraud who had borrowed from travelers' tales. He paraded the codex in his lectures, yet offered only shallow interpretations, careful never to reveal its deeper narrative. Still, the whispers grew. Scholars from abroad requested to see Daniel's notes. A few even wrote letters of support. Daniel pressed on, driven by both fury and faith. One late night, tracing his ink-stained fingers across a sequence of glyphs, he uncovered the Codex's greatest revelation, a temple, drawn with remarkable precision, set upon a foreign shore. Above it, glyphs spelled out a phrase he painstakingly pieced together. The jaguar sleeps where Rome's sun sets. His chest constricted. Could it be describing contact with Rome itself? The thought was staggering. If true, this single codex proved that Mayan voyagers had reached Europe centuries before Columbus ever dreamed of sailing. The next morning, Daniel stood in the lecture hall once again, notebook in hand. Marquez watched from the shadows, sneering. But when Daniel unveiled the glyphs, reading aloud their meaning with calm conviction, the hall fell silent. For once, no one laughed. A gray-bearded scholar leaned forward, whispering, "Rome, could it be?" Another nodded, awestruck. The air pulsed with realization. Daniel's discovery, his stolen codex, his stolen voice, was no longer his alone. It had become a truth too immense to contain. Marquez's face hardened, fury burning beneath his composure. But Daniel saw it clearly. Now the fear, the desperation of a man watching his empire of arrogance crumble. Daniel closed his notebook with steady hands. He was no longer the quiet archivist hidden in the cellar. He was the bearer of a truth carved in glyphs, a truth that even betrayal could not silence. Spring sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of San Miguel Church, scattering jewel tones across the worn stone floor. Months had passed since Daniel Alvarez first pried open the hidden door in the cellar, yet the weight of that night still lingered in every step he took within the sanctuary. But the man who walked now was not the same archivist who had once been invisible. On the altar table lay a freshly bound volume, not the codex itself, which Marquez still clung to in desperate arrogance, but Daniel's meticulous transcription. His notebook, once filled in secrecy, had been published in partnership with scholars abroad who recognized its significance. Across the world, debates raged, journals published fevered arguments, and expeditions were proposed to trace the Codex's account of Mayan voyagers in Europe. And through it all, Daniel's name was no longer whispered in mockery, but spoken with respect. He sat in the pews, watching Elena carefully organize letters from universities overseas. She smiled, her eyes bright. "They're calling it the Alvarez transcription. Historians in Mexico, Rome, even Cairo want to collaborate. You've given the Codex its voice back." Daniel bowed his head, humbled. "Not me," he murmured. "The Codex. I was only its caretaker." Yet he could not deny the transformation within himself. He recalled the years of silence, the humiliations endured, the voices that told him he was nothing. Each had been a chain. But the moment he chose to speak, to believe in the worth of what he carried, those chains had shattered. Across the courtyard of the university, Marquez now walked alone. Once celebrated, he had been exposed as a thief. Scholars who once clung to his words now whispered of his betrayal. Though he still kept the codex locked in his office, the world no longer cared for his possession of it. The narrative belonged to Daniel, and the truth could not be stolen. Daniel sometimes thought of confronting him again, but he no longer needed to. Marquez's punishment was in his isolation, in the hollow echo of a name that had once inspired awe and now drew suspicion. Pride had been his fortress, but the Codex had turned it into a prison. Weeks later, Daniel returned to the cellar where it all began. The chamber was empty now, the chest removed, the dust disturbed by footsteps of priests and curious onlookers. He stood in the silence, remembering the moment his hand first brushed the carved lid, the impossible discovery waiting beneath. He whispered into the shadows, "You were hidden, but not lost, and neither was I." A calm settled over him. He no longer feared being unseen, for the Codex had taught him that the overlooked often carry the greatest truths. History was not shaped solely by kings, warriors, or professors. Sometimes it was rewritten by the quiet archivist in a cellar. As he stepped into the sunlight, the bells of San Miguel tolled, carrying their sound across the town like a proclamation. Daniel lifted his face to the sky, his chest filled with a peace he had never known. The Codex had given him more than discovery, it had given him voice, dignity, and the certainty that humility often sees further than arrogance ever will. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.